Certainly some people will put up resistance, but to do so is reaching the point of suicide. There are a few pockets left in densely wooded areas where there's some hills and rock and cover that make it harder to get at them. But for the most part, it's effectively over. And the Russians are clearly building up for and planning for some sort of major operation. I don't know if this is just to clean everything out all the way up to the Dnieper River and then to cross it into Kiev. I have no idea. But the longer this takes and the more evidence they see that we have no intention of honoring two critical conditions, which they regard as non-negotiable in Ukraine. One, it must be neutral on the model of, say, the Austrian State Treaty, which I've been writing about for years. The second is that the territories that they have annexed to Russia will be recognized as legitimate. That's Crimea plus, obviously, the oblasts in eastern Ukraine. Beyond that, they're willing to negotiate. But if you're not going to recognize the realities of those two things, then there's no point in talking. So I think the Russians are prepared for the possibility that we won't do that. We will not recognize those things, that we will insist on the impossible, putting Western troops on the ground in Ukraine, any number of things to buy us time to further enhance or build up another apparatus in Western Ukraine that will be hostile to Russia.
Douglas Macgregor's assessment paints a stark picture of the situation in Ukraine, emphasizing the futility of resistance against the Russian military's overwhelming force and the geopolitical realities shaping the conflict. He describes the remaining Ukrainian resistance as isolated and largely symbolic, concentrated in heavily wooded or rugged areas that provide some natural cover. Yet, he argues that continuing such resistance borders on suicidal, given the dominance of Russian forces and the strategic advantage they currently hold. Macgregor highlights that the broader military campaign appears to be entering a new phase, with Russia preparing for a significant operation. While the specific objectives of this operation remain uncertain, Macgregor speculates that it could involve clearing out remaining resistance in areas up to the Dnieper River, or even advancing further into Kiev. Such moves would signify a decisive escalation, underlining Russia's intent to solidify its control over critical territories and force a resolution on its terms. At the core of Russia's strategy, Macgregor identifies two non-negotiable conditions that Moscow insists must be met for any meaningful negotiations. First, Ukraine must adopt neutrality akin to the Austrian State Treaty, which established Austria as a neutral state during the Cold War. This demand underscores Russia's deep-seated concerns about NATO expansion and the potential for Ukraine to become a staging ground for Western military forces. Neutrality, in Russia's view, would serve as a buffer, ensuring that Ukraine does not pose a direct threat to its security. The second condition involves the recognition of territories that Russia has annexed as legitimate parts of the Russian Federation. This includes Crimea, which Russia has controlled since 2014, and the eastern Ukrainian oblasts that have been integrated into Russia following the ongoing conflict. These territories are not merely strategic assets for Russia, but also symbols of its broader geopolitical ambitions and its resistance to what it perceives as Western encroachment. Macgregor emphasizes that without acknowledgement of these two realities, any negotiations would be fruitless from Russia's perspective. Macgregor critiques the West's unwillingness to engage with these conditions, suggesting that such resistance only prolongs the conflict and exacerbates its human and economic toll. He argues that the United States and its allies seem intent on pursuing what he describes as impossible objectives, such as deploying Western troops in Ukraine or building a hostile infrastructure in Western Ukraine to counter Russia. Such strategies, Macgregor contends, are not only impractical but also escalate tensions unnecessarily, pushing the region closer to prolonged instability. According to Macgregor, the Russian leadership appears to be prepared for the possibility that the West will refuse to acknowledge these realities. In response, Russia is likely to double down on its military objectives, further consolidating its control over annexed territories and potentially expanding its operations to preempt any Western moves. This resolve underscores Moscow's broader strategy of forcing a resolution on its terms, regardless of the costs or the duration of the conflict. Macgregor's analysis also touches on the broader geopolitical implications of the conflict. He suggests that the West's actions in Ukraine are not merely about supporting Ukrainian sovereignty, but are part of a larger strategy to undermine Russia and maintain Western dominance. This approach, however, risks further entrenching divisions and fueling a broader confrontation between Russia and the West. By refusing to engage with Russia's core demands, Macgregor warns, the West is not only prolonging the conflict but also missing an opportunity to de-escalate and stabilize the region. In Macgregor's view, the path forward requires a pragmatic approach that acknowledges the realities on the ground and prioritizes diplomacy over military confrontation. This includes recognizing Ukraine's neutrality and the annexed territories as a starting point for negotiations. While such concessions may be politically challenging for Western leaders, Macgregor argues that they are essential for achieving a lasting resolution and avoiding further escalation. The alternative, he warns, is a prolonged and increasingly destructive conflict that will have devastating consequences not only for Ukraine but also for the broader international community. By continuing to insist on unattainable objectives, the West risks deepening the crisis and further entrenching divisions, making a peaceful resolution increasingly elusive. For Macgregor, the choice is clear. Engage with the realities of the situation and pursue a negotiated settlement, or face the prospect of an unending and catastrophic conflict. According to Douglas Macgregor, certainly, some resistance remains, but continuing to fight at this stage borders on suicide. There are a few pockets of holdouts in densely wooded areas with hills and rocky terrain that provide some cover, making them harder to dislodge. However, for the most part, the situation is effectively over. The Russians are clearly preparing for a major operation, though the specifics remain unclear. This could involve clearing everything up to the Dnipro River, or even crossing it to advance toward Kiev, but that is speculative. The longer this situation drags on, the more evident it becomes that the West has no intention of honoring two non-negotiable conditions for Russia. First, Ukraine must adopt a neutral status, similar to the Austrian state treaty model, which has been discussed extensively. Second, the territories annexed by Russia, including Crimea and the oblasts in eastern Ukraine, must be recognized as legitimate Russian territory. Beyond these points, Russia is willing to negotiate. However, if these conditions are not acknowledged, any dialogue is effectively meaningless. The Russians seem prepared for the possibility that the West will refuse to meet these terms and may instead pursue actions they view as provocative, such as deploying Western troops in Ukraine or establishing another hostile apparatus in the country's west. These measures would only escalate tensions further. Thanks for watching.